years. So let's start with this. The name I don't hear anymore is Alabama. The Crimson Tide, they're now number 7. Do they have any chance of winding up in this playoff?
No, and the reason I say no is because the selection committee's bar for a team that does not win a conference championship is much, much higher. It's one thing to talk about a 2-loss LSU that wins the West, wins the SEC. It's an entirely different conversation in the committee meeting room to talk about a 2-loss Alabama that didn't win its division, lost 2 games. And the other thing, too, is their best wins are against Texas and Ole Miss. I just don't think that's going to cut it.
I understand. I mean, their strength of record, according to our resume ranks here, is 5th. But that doesn't do much. Let me get to TCU. They win the miracle game this past weekend on the last-second field goal. Can they afford to lose to Iowa State and still make it?
I'm not going to rule them out entirely if it's a close loss, but it is clear, because the committee didn't bump them up each of the past 2 weeks after back-to-back road wins, that this team has little to no margin for error. They do not like the fact that they've continually had to come back in these games. The committee chair mentioned that this week.
All right, so they may need to win out. And then if you're going to bet that palatial estate of yours in Maryland, which team is going to win the national championship?
Greeny, I sat here in August. I told you Ohio State was going to win it all. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to continue to stick with the Buckeyes. And I say that because I think they're the best team of the other contenders that can give Georgia fits. And the reason is because C.J. Stroud at quarterback, their turnover margin, and the fact that Georgia has looked vulnerable at times. They've had an ugly win against Missouri, and Kentucky wasn't exactly a blowout.
Ohio State's got to get through this weekend against Michigan. Michigan may be playing without candidly, the most important player on their team and their running back, Blake Corum, which would change the dynamic of this game completely, right?
100%. I mean, not only Blake Corum, but his backup, their starting tight end, and of course, both coaches are mum on their injury situations, but both groups of running backs have been banged up.
Big loss to South Carolina. It is LSU sitting at 5 and USC sitting at 6. Paul Finebaum is with us, but Heather, let's start with that. What does that mean for the folks who didn't watch it last night? What message is the committee sending by putting LSU 5 and USC 6?
That if LSU runs the table and somehow beats Georgia to win the SEC, they're going to make history as the first 2-loss team in the college football playoff. Feels like going into the rankings, some people had questions. Could they really do this, a 2-loss team? Yes, absolutely. The committee chair, Boo Corrigan, spoke repeatedly last night about how they like LSU's wins, and that trumps what USC has done against Oregon State and UCLA.
Okay, so you all know me. All I root for is chaos in all of this. So let's try and figure out some means to this. Paul, let's start with that first off. As we always try and figure out teams that control their destiny, do you agree that LSU is now clearly one of those teams? Win and they are in?
Absolutely. I mean, they're sitting there at 5 with a victory over Georgia, and they'll be about a 15, 16-point underdog in Atlanta next week. They'll have a win over the number 1 team in the country. They'll also, Greeny, have a win over Alabama, which will be probably in the top 6, maybe a little bit higher, depending on the chaos. I realize that they lost the opener, but the chairman said that's not going to be held against them, a 1-point loss against FSU. The glaring problem on their resume is on October 8th when they lost at home by 27 to Tennessee. But they haven't lost since, and I think that will weigh heavily on the committee's mind.
All right, so again, the scenario that Paul just laid out for you, talking about beating all of that is presupposing they beat Georgia. So, Paul, that then begets the next question. Is Georgia in anyway? If Georgia should lose that game to LSU, is Georgia in anyway, which would create a scenario where the SEC has 2 teams in?
Georgia will be in, and they have Georgia Tech this weekend, so we'll move past that game. And Greeny, I can't even come up with a scenario. I mean, last year they got blown out by Alabama in the same spot. They were still in. Now, again, Alabama was maybe a little higher regarded than LSU is this year with 1 loss versus 2, but I don't think there's going to be a debate. Georgia can punch a ticket. And then it's just a matter of where they land in terms of seeding. The first round games are in Atlanta and in Phoenix, so they may be deprived of playing in Atlanta with a loss, but that would be about the only penalty I can see.
Okay, fair enough. So let's live in that world for a minute here, because then, Heather, it feels to me like we've got the winner of the Ohio State-Michigan game, let's put them in. Mm-hmm. And then you have TCU, if they win out, we put them in. That seems to me as though it would be the end of the field. Otherwise, you're looking at a 1-loss, potentially conference champion USC. If they beat Notre Dame this weekend, you're looking at the loser of the Ohio State-Michigan game. Do those teams basically get left out of this mix in the event that LSU wins the SEC?
The selection committee would at least have a deep dive conversation on Georgia as a loser in the SEC championship game compared to a one-loss USC that just beat 3 straight ranked opponents. And we have to remember that in that scenario, Georgia's best win would be in the season opener against Oregon. USC probably could play Oregon in the Pac-12 Conference Championship game, common opponent. So all of those things would factor in, but I lean towards what Paul is saying because the selection committee said that Georgia separated itself from the rest of the country as the #1 team.
So then let's go to the other and more likely scenario, which is Georgia beats LSU in the SEC championship game. That takes LSU out of the mix with their 3rd loss. That puts Georgia in. An unbeaten TCU, if they stay that way, and that's not a guarantee, puts them in. The winner of Ohio State, Michigan, we would assume is certainly a lock to get in. And then who?
Then I lean towards one-loss USC or the loser of Ohio State, Michigan.
That's where I'm going. How does that team get in?
That team gets in more likely if it's Ohio State because the committee has repeatedly referred to Ohio State's win against Notre Dame as something that's slightly different than Michigan's resume. And I know Michigan fans are so annoyed with me for continuing to bring up their strength of schedule, but it's the 2nd weakest non-conference schedule in the FBS, and they will continue to talk about that in the committee meeting room if they don't beat the Buckeyes, because if they don't beat Ohio State, their best win is against Penn State.
All right, and you know what? Here's the thing that I've just discovered that is phenomenal. The minute we started talking about the Big Ten and not the SEC, Paul's dog started barking. Did anyone else notice that? I don't know if that was audible on television or not, but it was definitely audible to me. Paul, you even have your dogs trained to be SEC fans.
Breaking news, my dog does not like Jim Harbaugh.
Well done. Stay close by. Much more on this as we go. Again, the committee's sending messages, and we're here to interpret them for you. As we continue, Aaron Rodgers sending a message yesterday. We need to interpret what he said, talking about his last dance in Green Bay. Hasselbeck, are you buying it?
I was saying that there's no way that in that game against Green Bay, the Packers were still down by 14 headed in the 4th quarter. And we know that the Giants are incapable of scoring anything more than 24 points. They'll give you somewhere between 19 to 24. If the Cowboys can score their regular amount of points, which I think they can because the Giants defense has some good defensive linemen, but they're a little deficient in the talent category. I think it's going to be really hard for them to score with them. The problem isn't can the Cowboys stop the run. I think they're going to have a hard time with this Giants run, but I don't think the Giants have a chance of scoring with the Cowboys, particularly the way they've been scoring lately. So it's nice. You can hope for that, especially when you have some ties to that team. Maybe that could be skewing part of your selection, but I think it's unrealistic to suspect that the Giants, a team that we know have overachieved all season, has a real chance in this game on Thursday.
That is the interesting way of looking. Hasselbeck, let me come to you on that because the world will look at this as Saquon against the Cowboys' running defense. But I'm sort of with Neek. This game, to me, will come down to if the Cowboys can score 24, 28 points, and they've been doing it regularly against a good Giant defense, that might be too much for Daniel Jones. How do you see the game?
Yeah, Greeny, I think you're right. And listen, you're saying 24. What if they score 31 points? Because that's what they're averaging in Dak's last 21 starts. They're averaging 31 points and 400 yards of offense with Dak as the starting quarterback. I think people need to understand how well Dak Prescott is playing. I mean, you just go to the start of last season. Again, starts, that Dak Prescott has had. Look, they've been the #1 offense in football. Not the Bills with Josh Allen, not the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes, the Dallas Cowboys with Dak Prescott as a starter. So, yeah, I don't think it's just about, Saquon running it against that Dallas defense and all that. That is the formula. Chris is right. That's the formula. You obviously want to keep that Dallas offense off the field, but let's just also kind of give them some respect for how good they've been offensively with Dak as the starting quarterback.
And Chris, let me come back to you. I mean, I love the take, and we'll see what happens tomorrow. We're all, those of us without a rooting interest are just rooting for a good game. But I think a lot of people have looked at the Giants the last couple of games and thought they've been exposed. This was a team that was doing it with smoke, mirrors, and great coaching, and now they've been exposed. Does this pick by you suggest to me that you, Chris Canty, actually believe the Giants are somewhat for real and will be interesting the final month or two of this season?
Yeah, G, I think what we saw last week against Detroit is an outlier. If you look at it, it's the first game where Daniel Jones has multiple interceptions, and the only game this season where the New York Giants have 3 turnovers, and then compound that with Saquon Barkley having the fewest touches and the fewest yards from scrimmage. And I think you can understand why the Giants found themselves on the losing end of that game against the Lions. But I don't anticipate that being the case on a short week. I think the Giants do get back to basics. They did lose Wan'Dale Robinson early in the fourth quarter, which forces them more to be reliant on the run game. So going up against a defense that is 30th in run stop win rate, I think that's the opportunity for the Giants to shorten the game and keep that Cowboys offense off the field.
I like the way you're thinking. Everybody stay right where you are. We have much more on the 3 very interesting NFL games